What most people misunderstand about women who live alone without a man is that they didn't fail at love. They refused to settle for a life that was slowly killing them from the inside. We live in a world that still whispers, sometimes shouts, that a woman alone is a woman incomplete, that her home without a man's name on it is somehow less of a home, that her silence at night is loneliness, when in reality, for millions of women, that silence is the first peace they have ever known. Here's what nobody talks about. The woman who lives alone didn't give up. She woke up. She looked at the version of herself she was becoming, smaller, quieter, more apologetic, and she chose differently. She chose herself. Not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but out of a radical, almost terrifying self-respect. And that scares people. Because a woman who needs nothing from you to feel whole, that's not a woman society knows how to control. That's not a woman who fits the story we were all handed at birth. So before you pity her, before you ask, but don't you get lonely? Understand this. She is not waiting to be saved. She is not a chapter waiting to begin. She is the story, and she's just getting started. Let's talk about something most people won't say out loud. When a woman chooses to live alone, truly alone, without a man in her home, in her bed, in her daily life, the world around her doesn't stay quiet about it. People have opinions. People have concerns. People have that specific look they give her across the dinner table, the one that says, "We're worried about you," when what they actually mean is, "We don't understand you." And that makes us uncomfortable. And that discomfort, it has nothing to do with her. Here's the truth that takes most people years to understand. Society was not built around the image of a woman standing alone and thriving. It was built around a woman standing beside someone, completing a picture, filling a role. For centuries, a woman's value was measured by who she belonged to. First her father, then her husband. Her worth was relational, her identity was positional. She existed in the eyes of the world in reference to a man. So when a woman steps outside of that structure, when she builds a life that doesn't include a man at its center, it doesn't just challenge a preference, it challenges a system. And systems don't like to be challenged. They push back, they pathologize, they turn a choice into a problem. They take her freedom and rename it failure. Think about the language we use. We say she's still single, as if singleness has an expiration date she already missed. We say she couldn't find anyone, as if she spent years searching and came home empty-handed. We say she ended up alone, as if aloneness is where broken things go to be forgotten. Every word is loaded, every word is a quiet verdict. And that verdict says something went wrong here. But nothing went wrong. Something went right. Because what that woman did, what she consciously or unconsciously chose, was to refuse the version of her life that required her to shrink. And shrinking is what so many women have been conditioned to do inside relationships that were never truly equal. Shrinking their opinions to keep the peace. Shrinking their ambitions to protect someone else's ego. Shrinking their needs because the relationship only had room for one person's needs, and somehow it was never hers. The self-sufficient woman didn't walk away from love. She walked away from a specific kind of pain that had been dressed up as love for so long that most people couldn't tell the difference anymore. And society doesn't forgive that, not easily, not quietly, because here's what her choice exposes. It exposes the fact that for a lot of people, especially women, staying in a relationship isn't always about love. Sometimes it's about fear, fear of judgment, fear of financial instability, fear of what the family will say, fear of who you'll be when there's no one else in the room defining you. And when one woman stands up and says, "I faced that fear and I chose myself anyway," it holds up a mirror to everyone who didn't. To everyone who stayed not because they were happy, but because leaving felt too costly. That mirror is uncomfortable. So instead of looking into it, people point at her and call her the problem. They call her cold, they call her damaged, they say she must have trust issues, commitment issues, unresolved wounds from her past. They build an entire psychological case against her peace. Because it is far easier to diagnose her freedom than to examine their own captivity. And the cruelest part, she often starts to believe it. She starts to wonder if something really is wrong with her. If her desire for space is selfishness, if her love of her own company is a symptom, if the life she built, the one that genuinely feels like hers, is actually just evidence of her inability to connect, this is where the damage happens, not in the living alone. In the story, she's been handed about what the living alone means. Because when you strip away every cultural narrative, every family expectation, every romantic comedy that ends with a woman finally being chosen, when you clear all of that noise away and look at the actual life of a woman who lives alone and has built something real inside that solitude, what you find is not a cautionary tale. What you find is a woman who knows herself with a depth that is genuinely rare. She knows what she values because she's never had to negotiate away. She knows what brings her peace because she's the one who created it. She knows what she will and will not accept because she's had enough silence and enough space to hear her own instincts clearly, without someone else's voice constantly layered over the top of them. She has learned to be accountable to herself in a way that is extraordinarily difficult when you're always performing for an audience of one more person. She fixes things, she makes decisions. She figures it out, not because she's trying to prove something, but because there's no one else in the room to hand the hard things to. And that builds something inside her. Something quiet and solid and deeply grounded. It builds a kind of confidence that doesn't need external validation to stay standing. Because she has validated herself every single day just by choosing her own life and making it work. That is not a woman to pity. That is a woman to study. But society won't reframe her that way. Not yet. Not without a fight. Because reframing her would require admitting that the structure we built, the one where a woman needs a man to be whole and respectable and complete, was never actually about her well-being. It was about order, about roles, about a system that functions more smoothly when everyone stays in their assigned position and doesn't ask too many questions about whether the position actually fits. She asked. She looked around at her assigned position and she asked, is this actually what I want? Or is this just what I was told to want? And when the honest answer came back, she had the courage to act on it. That courage is what people call threatening. That clarity is what gets pathologized into damage. That self-knowledge is what makes people pull her aside at weddings and tell her with genuine concern that she shouldn't wait too long. Too long for what, exactly? To be chosen by someone who may not deserve her, to build a life around another person's needs before she has finished building herself, to measure her completeness by someone else's decision to stay. She's not waiting, that's the part they keep missing. She's not in a holding pattern, killing time until her real life begins. This is her real life. She is living it right now, fully and deliberately, and the fact that it doesn't match the picture on the box is not a defect. It is the most honest thing about her. And the women who have lived this, who have sat alone on a Sunday morning with their coffee and their thoughts and a deep, uncomplicated sense of belonging to themselves, they know exactly what I'm talking about. They know the particular quality of peace that exists in a space that is entirely your own. They know what it feels like to stop performing femininity for an audience and just exist, plainly and fully, as a person. They also know the loneliness. Let's not pretend they don't. There are nights, there are seasons, there are moments when the silence feels like absence rather than presence. But here is what they understand that the outside world doesn't. They have learned to sit inside that feeling without running from it. They have learned that loneliness, real loneliness, isn't cured by having a body in the next room. It's cured by having a genuine relationship with yourself. And that is precisely what living alone teaches you if you're brave enough to let it. So the next time someone looks at a woman who lives alone and sees a problem to be solved, a gap to be filled, a life that needs correcting, understand what you're actually looking at. You are looking at a woman who refused to disappear. There is a question that follows women who live alone like a shadow. Don't you get lonely? It gets asked at family gatherings, over lunch with co-workers, in quiet moments between old friends who chose different paths. It gets asked with concern, with pity, sometimes with a thinly veiled sense of relief that the person asking didn't end up in the same situation. And the woman on the receiving end of that question usually smiles, gives a safe answer and moves on, because the real answer is complicated. And the real answer requires a distinction that most people have never been taught to make, the distinction between loneliness and solitude. These two things live in completely different rooms. They feel different in the body. They produce different results in the mind. They mean entirely different things about who you are and how you relate to yourself. But we collapse them into one word, one feeling, one condition, and in doing so, we make it nearly impossible for a woman living alone to describe her actual experience without being misunderstood. So let's separate them clearly. Loneliness is a state of disconnection. It is the ache that comes when you need human contact, genuine warmth, the feeling of being seen and known by another person, and that need goes unmet. Loneliness is real, it is painful. It is a human experience that belongs to all of us at different points in our lives, regardless of whether we live with one person or 10. You can be profoundly lonely in a marriage. You can be devastatingly lonely in a house full of children and noise and motion. Loneliness is not about the number of people around you. It is about the quality of connection available to you, and more importantly, the quality of connection you have with yourself. Solitude is something else entirely. Solitude is chosen space. It is the intentional act of being alone in a way that restores rather than depletes. It is the quiet that comes after a long day when you close the door to your own home and exhale fully without adjusting yourself for anyone. It is Sunday mornings that belong entirely to you. It is the freedom to follow your own thoughts without interruption, to sit with your feelings without performing them for an audience, to simply exist without the constant low-level work of managing another person's emotional world alongside your own. Solitude is not the absence of connection, it is a specific kind of presence with yourself. And here is where it gets psychologically important. Most people never learn to be present with themselves because they are never truly alone long enough to try. From childhood, we are surrounded, we are socialized, shaped, observed, responded to. We learn who we are largely through the mirror of other people's reactions to us, and that is not without value. But it means that many people arrive at adulthood having never sat quietly with themselves long enough to know who they actually are beneath all the reflecting. Women in particular are conditioned to be relational before they are individual, to attune to others, to read the room, to prioritize connection over inner life. This is not a character flaw. It is the result of years of social training that rewarded women for being responsive to others and made them feel guilty, selfish, or strange for wanting time that was entirely their own. So when a woman finally creates a life that gives her solitude, real sustained solitude, not just stolen moments between responsibilities, something begins to happen inside her that is both uncomfortable and profound. She starts to hear herself, not the version of herself that exists in response to others, not the self that is shaped by what her partner needs or what her family expects or what the relationship requires her to be at any given moment, the actual self, the one underneath all the adaptation, The one with real opinions and genuine preferences and an interior life that has been quietly running in the background for years, waiting for a moment of stillness to finally come forward. For some women, this is disorienting at first, because when the noise clears, what surfaces isn't always comfortable. Old feelings come up, unexamined beliefs rise to the top. Questions she avoided by staying busy, by staying coupled, by staying in constant motion, suddenly have nowhere to hide. Solitude in its early stages can feel almost confrontational, like meeting someone you've been avoiding and realizing the person you were avoiding was yourself. But women who stay with it, who don't immediately fill the space with noise and distraction and new relationships to manage, discover something on the other side of that discomfort. They discover that they are genuinely good company, not in an arrogant way, in a simple, grounded, quietly revolutionary way. They discover that their own mind is an interesting place to spend time, that their own instincts, when given space to speak, are worth listening to, that the voice inside them, the one that always knew what they needed and what they valued and what felt true, was never broken or untrustworthy. It was just drowned out. Solitude gives that voice back, and here is why that matters far beyond the personal. A woman who has developed a genuine relationship with her own solitude is not the same kind of person in relationships, in friendships, in work, in every corner of her life. She is different in a way that is deeply anchored. She does not need external validation to feel stable, because she has built stability inside herself through the practice of being alone and finding it sufficient. She does not confuse presence with value, because she has learned that being physically surrounded by people can coexist with feeling entirely invisible. She does not stay in things that diminish her simply because the alternative is being alone, because she knows that alone is not the worst thing. She has lived it. She has sat inside it. She knows its texture and its weight and its unexpected gifts. This is the thing that people who have never truly been alone don't understand. They imagine the loneliness of it without being able to imagine the freedom. They picture the empty chair at the dinner table without being able to picture the peace of a morning that belongs entirely to you, the decision made without compromise, the evening shaped exactly by your own energy without calculation or negotiation. They see the cost but not the return, and the return is immense. The woman who has learned to inhabit her solitude without fear, without restlessness, without the constant urge to escape into noise or company or distraction, she has done something that very few people ever do. She has become her own home, not a temporary shelter, not a waiting room, a real, solid, inhabitable home, the kind you don't have to leave yourself to walk into. That doesn't mean she doesn't want connection. That doesn't mean she has closed herself off from love or intimacy or the warmth of other people. Wanting solitude and wanting connection are not opposites. They are not at war with each other. In fact, the woman who is genuinely at peace in her own company is often the most present person in any room she chooses to enter, because she is there by choice, not by need. Because she is giving her energy freely, not desperately. Because she is connected to herself first, which means what she brings to others is real. That quality of presence, that groundedness, it is not something you can manufacture. It is not something you can shortcut your way into. It is something you earn by doing the hard, quiet work of learning to be alone without running away from what the aloneness reveals about you. Most people never do that work. Not because they are weak, but because the world makes it very easy to avoid it. There is always another relationship to enter, another distraction to pick up, another reason to stay in motion. The world does not encourage stillness. It does not reward women for investing in their relationship with themselves the way it rewards them for investing in their relationship with others. But the women who choose solitude anyway, who protect it, who return to it, who allow it to teach them, those women know something quietly essential about what it means to be a whole person. They know that you cannot truly give what you have never sat still long enough to find. And they found it, not in spite of being alone, but because of it. Loneliness is what happens when you lose connection with others. Solitude is what happens when you finally find connection with yourself. And a woman who has found that, who has walked through the discomfort and arrived at genuine peace inside her own company, she is not a woman to feel sorry for. She is a woman who has done the one thing most people spend their entire lives avoiding. She learned how to come home to herself. There is a version of yourself that only appears when no one is watching. Not the version you present at work. Not the version that shows up for family dinners or first dates or Sunday brunches, where everyone is performing a slightly polished variation of who they actually are. Not the version that laughs at the right moments, softens her edges for the comfort of the room, or quietly adjusts her opinions based on who's sitting across from her. The version that appears when no one is watching is the one that has been waiting the longest. And for many women, living alone is the first real opportunity that version has ever had to step forward. This is what people don't talk about when they talk about women who live alone. They focus on what's missing: the partner, the shared meals, the warmth of another body in the house. They inventory the absences and call it analysis, but they completely overlook what becomes possible in that space, what returns, what gets reclaimed, what quietly grows back like something that was cut down for years and finally has room to reach toward the light. Identity, her actual identity. Not the one she built around someone else's needs. Not the one that was shaped, over months or years, by the slow and often invisible pressure of being in close proximity to another person's personality, preferences, and expectations, her own. Because here is something that almost never gets said clearly enough. Relationships change us. Not always in the ways we choose, not always in the ways we notice. There is a psychological phenomenon that happens in long-term partnerships where two people who spend enough time together begin to merge. Their habits blend, their tastes influence each other. Their fears and insecurities and unhealed wounds quietly transfer through the air between them like a language neither of them ever consciously chose to learn. And for women especially who are socialized from birth to attune, to accommodate, to prioritize relational harmony above personal truth, this merging often goes in one direction. She gives more of herself to the shape of the relationship than she gets back. She bends, she adjusts. She learns to want what works for both of them rather than asking too loudly about what works for her alone. She does this so naturally, so automatically, that she often doesn't realize it's happening until years later when she looks in the mirror and struggles to recognize exactly who is looking back. Not because she was with a bad person necessarily. Sometimes the relationship was genuinely loving. Sometimes the person beside her had good intentions and real warmth. But good intentions do not prevent the slow erosion of self that happens when a woman is never fully alone, never fully unobserved, never fully free from the quiet performance of being someone's partner. Living alone ends that performance. And the first thing that happens when the performance ends is not liberation. Let's be honest about that. The first thing that happens is disorientation. Because when you have spent a significant portion of your life being defined in relation to someone else, when your daily choices have been shaped around another person's presence, when your sense of self has been built at least partially on the foundation of being someone's girlfriend or wife or partner, and then that scaffolding comes down, you don't immediately stand tall and free in the open air. You stand there wondering who you are without the structure. What do you actually like to eat when no one else's preferences are on the table? What time do you naturally wake up when no one else's schedule is pulling at yours? What kind of space do you want to live in when the aesthetic is entirely your decision? What do you want to do on a Saturday afternoon when there is no one to compromise with, no one to consider, no one whose idea of a good day has any claim on yours? These feel like small questions. They are not small questions. They are the questions that, when answered honestly over time, begin to draw the outline of an actual self. A self with specific tastes and genuine preferences and a particular way of moving through the world that belongs to her and no one else. And as she answers them one by one, something begins to rebuild inside her. Something that was not destroyed, because it was never destroyable, but was covered over, layer by years of adaptation and accommodation. Her voice, her real voice, not the one calibrated for the relationship, the original one. She starts to hear what she actually thinks about things, not the opinion softened for someone else's comfort, but the real one. The one that sometimes surprises even her with its clarity and its certainty. She starts to notice what genuinely brings her pleasure versus what she convinced herself she enjoyed because it made the partnership easier. She starts to recognize the difference between choices she made freely and choices she made to manage someone else's emotions. And that recognition alone is worth an enormous amount. Because you cannot build a real life on a self you don't actually know. You can build a functional life, a comfortable life, a life that looks perfectly acceptable from the outside. But a real life, one that fits you precisely, that draws on your actual strengths and honors your genuine needs and moves in the direction of what you truly value, that requires knowing who you are when no one is shaping you. Living alone teaches her that, not through grand revelation, through accumulation, through the small daily acts of choosing for herself, answering only to herself, sitting with herself through both the easy days and the difficult ones, and discovering gradually that she is capable of far more than she was ever given room to demonstrate. She discovers she is resourceful, that the things she used to defer to someone else because it felt easier or more efficient or because the relationship had assigned to different roles, she can handle, she can figure them out. And in the figuring out, she learns something about her own competence that no one can give her and no one can take away. She earned it, she built it, it lives inside her now. She discovers she is resilient, that the hard nights, the ones she was most afraid of, the ones filled with doubt and loneliness and the particular weight of making all the decisions alone, she survives them. And then she survives the next one. And slowly survival becomes something more than survival. It becomes evidence. Evidence that she is stronger than the fear that told her she couldn't do this alone. She discovers she has taste, real specific, unapologetic taste. In the way she arranges her space, in the way she spends her time, in the art she chooses for her walls, and the books she keeps beside her bed, and the rituals she builds into her mornings. These things are small, and they are everything, because they are entirely hers. No compromise, no negotiation, no quiet guilt about taking up too much space with the fullness of who she actually is. And perhaps most powerfully, she discovers she has values, clear ones, ones she didn't fully know she had until she had enough silence to hear them. She learns what she will not tolerate, not from a place of bitterness or defensiveness, but from a place of self-knowledge so solid that certain things simply no longer have access to her. She has met herself clearly enough that the things which once confused her, the situation she once stayed in too long, the treatment she once accepted because she wasn't sure she deserved better, those things no longer have the same power over her. Because she knows now, she knows what her peace feels like. She knows the texture of a life that is genuinely hers, and that knowledge becomes a standard. Not a rigid wall, not a defense mechanism, but a true internal compass that orients her without requiring anyone else's input. This is what gets reclaimed when a woman lives alone. Not just her time, not just her space, her relationship with her own reality, her trust in her own perception. Her willingness to take up the full amount of room that her actual self requires without apology, without performance, without the constant low-grade anxiety of wondering whether the real her is too much or not enough. She stops performing. She starts existing. And the woman who has learned to exist fully without shrinking, without editing, without disappearing into the shape of what someone else needs her to be, she walks differently. She makes decisions differently. She enters rooms differently. Not because she became someone new, but because she finally became someone old, someone original. The person she was before the world started suggesting she be someone more convenient instead. Living alone didn't change her. It gave her back to herself. There is something that happens to a woman after she has lived alone long enough to know herself clearly. She stops loving out of hunger, and that changes everything. Most of us, if we're honest, enter relationships carrying a kind of emotional hunger, a need to be chosen, a need to feel that our presence matters to someone, that our absence would be noticed, that we are wanted in the specific and personal way that only intimacy can provide. That hunger is human. There is nothing shameful about it. But when hunger is your primary motivation for connection, it shapes the kind of connections you make. It makes you more likely to accept less than you deserve, more likely to overlook red flags because the alternative, going back to empty, feels worse than staying in something that doesn't fully fit. More likely to build a relationship around need rather than around genuine alignment, and then wonder years later why you feel so alone inside something that was supposed to fix that feeling. The woman who has lived alone, who has sat inside her own silence long enough to make peace with it, who has learned to feed herself emotionally without depending on another person to do it for her, she arrives at connection differently. She is not driven by hunger, she is driven by genuine desire. And those are two very different engines. Desire says, I want you in my life because you add something real to it. Hunger says, I need you in my life because I don't know how to be okay without you. Desire chooses with clarity, hunger chooses with desperation. And the relationships built from each of those starting points look completely different 5 years down the road. This is the part that people miss when they assume a woman who lives alone must struggle with relationships. They assume the solitude has made her cold or closed or incapable of the kind of vulnerability that real intimacy requires. But they have it exactly backwards. The woman who has done the work of knowing herself, who has spent genuine time in her own company without flinching, who has learned to sit with discomfort instead of outsourcing it to someone else, she is more capable of real intimacy than almost anyone. Because real intimacy requires you to bring an actual self to the table. And she has one. You cannot be truly intimate with someone you don't know. You can be close, you can be dependent. You can share a bed and a bank account and a decade of your life with someone while remaining fundamentally unknown to them because you were never fully known to yourself. True intimacy, the kind that sustains something over years, requires two people who are genuinely present, genuinely honest, genuinely willing to be seen as they actually are, rather than as the version they perform for comfort or approval. The woman who has lived alone has been practicing that presence on herself. She has been sitting with her own reality, her own contradictions, her own difficult emotions, without looking for someone else to resolve them. She has learned to stay in the room with herself when the room gets uncomfortable. And that skill, that willingness to stay present with difficulty rather than escape it, is exactly what healthy relationships require. She also loves with boundaries in a way that is frequently misunderstood. When people hear the word boundaries, they often imagine walls, barriers, a kind of emotional fortress that keeps people out and signals an unwillingness to be close. But that is not what real boundaries are. Real boundaries are not walls, they are doors. A wall keeps everything out indiscriminately. A door opens for the right people and closes for the wrong ones. It is selective. It is intentional. It is the opposite of defensive. The woman who lives alone knows exactly where her doors are. She knows what she will welcome in and what she will not. Not because she is damaged, not because past hurt has made her rigid, but because she has spent enough time in her own space to know what belongs there and what disturbs the quality of life she has built. She has a standard not as a demand she makes of others, but as a truth she holds about herself. And loving someone from that place, from a place of genuine self-knowledge and genuine self-respect, means she can be fully present without being fully consumed. She does not lose herself in love. And that is not a limitation. That is a gift to herself and to whoever she chooses. Because here is what actually happens in relationships where one person has no self outside the partnership. The relationship becomes the entire container for both people's emotional lives. Every need, every fear, every unresolved wound, every source of meaning and purpose and identity, it all gets poured into one person, one connection, one daily dynamic that was never designed to hold that much weight. And it collapses, not always dramatically. Sometimes slowly, quietly, under the pressure of expectations that were never spoken clearly, because neither person was clear enough about themselves to know what they were actually asking for. The woman who lives alone knows what she is asking for. She has thought about it. Not obsessively, not as a checklist she carries into every encounter, but as a natural result of having spent real time inside her own values. She knows the difference between what she wants and what she merely tolerates. She knows the difference between someone who genuinely sees her and someone who is projecting a comfortable fiction onto her and calling it love. She can feel that difference now, in her body, in the quality of her attention during a conversation, in whether she feels more or less herself after spending time with someone. That discernment is not coldness, it is clarity. And clarity is one of the most loving things a person can bring to another human being. She is also, perhaps surprisingly, more patient in relationships. Not the passive patience of someone who has learned to swallow her needs to keep the peace, but the active patience of someone who is not in a hurry. She is not racing toward a destination. She is not measuring the relationship against a timeline set by external expectations. She does not need this particular connection to become marriage or permanence or a public declaration of her worth, because her worth is not located inside the relationship, it is located inside her. And that means she can allow things to develop at the pace they naturally want to develop without forcing, without grasping, without the quiet desperation that turns potential into pressure. She gives people room to be who they actually are because she understands from personal experience what it costs a person to perform a version of themselves they were never meant to sustain. She watched herself do it. She felt what it did to her. She is not interested in asking that of someone else, and she communicates differently. Not perfectly, because no one communicates perfectly, but honestly, because she has nothing to protect that is more important to her than the truth of what she actually experiences. She has already faced herself. She has already sat inside her own darkness and her own confusion without crumbling. So the conversations that other people avoid, the ones about needs and fears and incompatibilities, and the honest naming of what is and isn't working, those conversations do not terrify her the way they terrify someone whose entire sense of self depends on the relationship staying intact at all costs. She can say the hard thing, and she can hear it back. That combination, the willingness to speak honestly and the capacity to receive honesty without collapsing, is extraordinarily rare. It is the foundation of every relationship that actually lasts. And it is built not in the presence of others, but in the quiet work of knowing yourself well enough that the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, feels safer than the alternative. She does not love perfectly. She does not arrive at every relationship whole and unburdened and completely free of the patterns that shaped her. She is human. She carries things, but she carries them consciously. She knows what she's carrying. And that awareness alone changes the dynamic of everything she builds with another person. She does not need to be saved. She does not need to be completed. She does not need someone else to make her life make sense, because her life already makes sense to her. What she wants, if she wants partnership at all, is someone to share a life that is already good, someone to add to something real, someone who meets her not in her emptiness, but in her fullness. And the love that grows from fullness rather than emptiness is a different kind of love entirely. It is chosen every single day, not because leaving is impossible, but because staying is genuinely wanted. That is not a woman who struggles to love. That is a woman who finally knows how, at some point, the narrative has to change. Not the narrative that other people hold about women who live alone. That will shift slowly, reluctantly, the way all deeply embedded cultural beliefs shift, with friction and resistance, and the quiet persistence of women who simply keep living their truth loudly enough that the old story loses its grip. That change will come. But the more urgent narrative, the one that needs to change first, is the one she holds about herself. Because the most damaging version of the story isn't the one her family tells at dinner. It isn't the one embedded in romantic comedies or whispered at weddings or printed between the lines of every magazine that ever told her she was running out of time. The most damaging version is the one she absorbed so deeply that it started to sound like her own voice. The one that says her life alone is a temporary condition rather than a legitimate destination. The one that frames everything she has built as a waiting room rather than a home. That story is a lie. And replacing it is not a small act, it is the whole work. Here is what is actually true. Every woman who has chosen to live alone, whether that choice arrived through deliberate intention or through circumstances that eventually became a freedom she decided to keep, is not standing at the edge of her life waiting for it to begin. She is standing in the middle of it, fully arrived, building something real, something layered, something that accumulates meaning not because of who is beside her, but because of how consciously she is choosing to inhabit every single day. That is not a consolation prize. That is the whole point. And the reframe matters because of what it changes in practice. When a woman understands her solitude as a foundation rather than a gap, she invests in it differently. She stops making temporary decisions, the ones driven by the unconscious belief that real life starts later, when the circumstances finally look the way they were supposed to look. She stops treating her home as a placeholder and starts treating it as a reflection of who she actually is. She stops postponing the things she wants to do, the trips, the projects, the habits, the version of daily life she has always imagined, until she has someone to do them with. She does them now, alone, fully, without apology and without waiting for permission from a future that may or may not arrive on anyone's timeline. This shift from waiting to building is not a minor psychological adjustment. It is a complete reorientation of how a woman relates to her own life. And the women who make that shift, who genuinely internalize that their life right now is the real one and not a rehearsal, move through the world with a quality of presence and intentionality that is unmistakable. They are not restless in the way that waiting produces restlessness. They are not anxious in the way that uncertainty about the future produces anxiety. They are grounded, purposeful, engaged with what is directly in front of them, because what is directly in front of them is not a distraction from real life. It is real life. And from that grounded place, they build extraordinary things. Not always extraordinary in the way the world measures extraordinary. It's not always public or praised or visible to anyone outside the walls of the life they are quietly constructing. But extraordinary in the truest sense, in the sense of being built with full awareness, full ownership, and full alignment with who they actually are. A career pursued without the compromises that come from anchoring major life decisions to another person's opportunities or fears. A creative life developed without someone else's discomfort, with her ambition setting the ceiling on what she allows herself to attempt. A financial life built entirely on her own terms, her own choices, her own relationship with money and security, and what she values enough to invest in. These are not small things. These are the architecture of an entire existence, and she builds them with a clarity that is genuinely rare. Because when your life is your own, entirely your own, the feedback loop between your choices and your outcomes is direct and clean. There is no shared responsibility to hide behind, no diffusion of accountability across two people's decisions. She chose this, it worked, or it didn't. She learns, she adjusts, she tries again. And over time, that direct relationship with consequence builds a kind of wisdom about herself and about the world that cannot be borrowed from anyone else. She also builds community differently. This is something that gets overlooked almost entirely in the conversation about women living alone. People assume that without a partner at the center, her world must be sparse, that she must be isolated by choice or by default. But the women who live this life know that the opposite is often true. Without a primary relationship consuming the majority of her relational energy, she has more of herself to give to friendships, to chosen family, to the wider network of people she actually wants to invest in, rather than the narrower world that coupledom so often quietly creates. Her friendships are not secondary relationships. They are primary ones. She shows up for them with the full weight of her attention and her care, not the leftover version that gets distributed after a partner has taken the bulk of what she has to give. She builds deep, sustained, genuinely reciprocal connections with people who know her completely and love her precisely. Not in spite of her solitude, but alongside it, in a way that honors both her need for deep connection and her equal need for independence. That combination, deep connection without the loss of self that so often accompanies it, is what she has built. And it is not a compromise, it is an achievement. She also builds a relationship with time that most people never access. Time, for the woman living alone, is not something that gets negotiated or divided or managed around another person's schedule and needs. It is hers, fully. And that means she can use it with a precision and an intentionality that transforms what is possible in a single life. She can go deep on the things that matter to her. She can follow a thread of curiosity for as long as it holds her interest without explaining herself. She can rest when she needs to rest and work when her energy is high and structure her days around her own rhythms, rather than a shared schedule that serves everyone moderately and no one completely. That relationship with time is a form of wealth that doesn't show up on any balance sheet but produces returns that compound quietly over years. The book written, the skill developed, the inner life deepened, the person she becomes through the sustained, uninterrupted practice of pursuing what genuinely matters to her. None of this requires her to close herself off from love or partnership or the possibility of a future that includes someone. None of it is a declaration of permanent solitude or a rejection of connection. It is simply a refusal to treat the present as less valuable than a hypothetical future. It is the decision to be fully here, fully invested, fully alive inside the life she has right now, rather than holding her breath for a different one. And that decision, made consciously, lived consistently, changes the entire quality of her existence. It changes what she notices. It changes what she creates. It changes the depth at which she engages with her own experience. It changes who she becomes year by year through the accumulation of choices made from a place of genuine self-determination, rather than from the anxious anticipation of a life that hasn't arrived yet. The woman who understands this, who has made the internal shift from waiting to building, who has claimed her present life as the real and full and worthy thing that it is, she does not wake up wondering if she is enough. She wakes up wondering what she will do with the day. And that question, simple as it sounds, is the difference between a life endured and a life inhabited. She is not a woman in a holding pattern. She is not a woman on pause. She is not a woman whose story is waiting for someone else to arrive and make it interesting. She is the author. She is the architect. She is the whole point. And the life she is building day by deliberate day, entirely on her own terms, is not a consolation for the life she didn't get. It is the life she chose.